Africa is often described as the poorest continent in the world, and many argue that its situation is worsening. Of the world's 26 low-income countries, 23 are located in sub-Saharan Africa. For decades, the Western world has attempted, sometimes half-heartedly, to help lift the continent out of poverty. In the early 1960s, billions were invested in infrastructure programs. In the 1980s, mass vaccination campaigns followed. In the 1990s, large portions of debt were written off, yet these efforts did not produce the expected transformation. Many explanations have been offered for this failure: corruption, colonial legacies, and poor governance. But what if the real reason were simpler? Since gaining independence, Africa has remained the most internally fragmented continent in the world. Only about 16% of its trade happens within the region, nearly 4 times less than in Asia or Europe. Instead, most goods are exported to massive markets such as the United States and China. Because individual African nations negotiate alone, they possess little bargaining power and often end up selling natural resources, diamonds, gold, and oil for extremely low returns. Imagine if all 55 African countries unified. Overnight, a patchwork of disconnected economies could become one of the largest markets on Earth, potentially transforming Africa into a global power capable of competing with China, the United States, and Europe. However, while unification sounds like an obvious solution, powerful interests benefit from keeping Africa divided, even if it traps the continent in poverty for generations. For most regions of the world, borders evolved over thousands of years and gradually reflected ethnic groups, cultures, and political institutions. In Africa, the opposite occurred. During the late 19th century scramble for Africa, European powers divided the continent within a few decades, drawing borders and conference rooms far away. These lines cut across rivers, trade routes, and communities, separating some societies while forcing others together. For example, the Somali people were split across 4 countries despite sharing a common language and culture for centuries. When independence arrived, the region did not emerge as a single nation, but as Somalia, Djibouti, Ethiopia, and Kenya. Large Somali populations suddenly found themselves ruled by governments dominated by different ethnic groups, creating deep resentment. By 1964, war erupted between Ethiopia and Somalia over the Somali-inhabited Ogaden region. This was not an isolated case. Nigeria fell into civil war over Biafra. Sudan eventually split after decades of North-South conflict. The Congo collapsed into chaos soon after independence. Since 1945, roughly 1/3 of the world's wars have taken place in Africa. Continuous conflict made large-scale regional trade almost impossible, and intra-African trade fell to less than 10% of total trade, 6 times lower than in Europe, Asia, or North America. As a result, newly independent states relied heavily on exporting raw materials to industrial economies. Yet competing globally was extremely difficult. Small countries selling widely available commodities had little leverage, while large economies producing unique goods could demand better terms. By the 1970s, Africa found itself trapped in this imbalance. Major global economic powers operated at continental scale. The United States alone accounted for about 40% of global GDP, while Europe held nearly 25%. Meanwhile, more than half of African countries had populations under 10 million, minimal manufacturing capacity, and exports dominated by a single commodity. Operating separately, they had almost no negotiating strength. Ghana sold cocoa largely through long-term contracts priced in London, and when it tried to push prices higher in the early 1960s, buyers shifted to Nigeria and Ivory Coast. Kenya faced the same issue with coffee, where prices were determined by international commodity exchanges dominated by Western buyers. Producers became price takers rather than negotiators. Whenever one country demanded better terms, buyers simply switched to another African supplier. Instead of improving conditions across the continent, nations were forced into competition with one another. Profits that could have funded domestic growth flowed overseas, leaving local businesses without capital for long-term investment. Even decades after independence, many African economies lagged behind despite possessing vast natural resources. The idea of collective bargaining was not new. By the 1960s, leaders recognized that lack of unity was costly. For a brief moment, there was momentum to fix it. In 1963, Ghana's first leader, Kwame Nkrumah, stood in Addis Ababa and warned African states to unite or perish. That same month, 32 newly independent nations signed a charter creating the Organization of African Unity. Many saw this as a turning point, but a major obstacle remained. Early African governments were fragile. Any leader appearing willing to surrender authority to a continental body risked losing power at home. In fact, the very architect of African unity experienced this firsthand, as his push for continental integration led critics to accuse him of prioritizing pan-African ideals over national interests. Critics argued that, instead of pursuing continental unity, Ghana should first defend its borders, stabilize national income, and solve domestic shortages rather than linking its future to neighboring economies that were just as fragile. That view still echoes in many parts of the world today. By 1966, only 3 years after the Organization of African Unity was created, Nkrumah was removed in a military coup while he was abroad. Unity may have been economically desirable, but politically it was extremely difficult. One major reason was that no one truly agreed on what a unified Africa would look like. Many imagined a single flag, one president, and a centralized government, yet most successful integration projects never began that way. They started by building shared markets. Europe provides a useful comparison. The European Union did not merge countries into one state. Instead, it spent decades gradually removing barriers that prevented businesses from expanding. Border inspections, incompatible product standards, and conflicting payment systems were reduced so that a company in Italy could sell in France or Germany without redesigning products or renegotiating contracts at every crossing. Over time, this transformed dozens of national economies into something that functioned like one large market. For Africa, unity would mean turning 55 separate markets into a single economic space where goods, capital, and people could move freely. Without that, countries are forced to develop companies inside markets that barely exist. This limitation is especially damaging because many African nations have populations comparable to European countries but far lower purchasing power. Rwanda illustrates this well. The country has improved governance, incomes, and business conditions over the past 2 decades, yet it remains a small market. Its population of about 13 million has limited spending capacity, and it lies far from major ports. Businesses therefore struggle to grow domestically, while trading with neighboring countries remains extremely costly. Transport costs highlight the problem. Shipping a container from Mombasa to Rotterdam or Shanghai may cost roughly $1,000 and take about 30 days. Moving that same container inland to Kigali, a much shorter distance, can cost up to $4,000 and take longer because of congestion and delays. According to the World Bank, transport costs within Africa are 50 to 75% higher than in other developing regions. Fragmentation plays a major role. Instead of one coordinated infrastructure system, more than 50 governments independently build roads, railways, power networks, and ports mainly to serve national borders. Transport routes frequently end at frontiers, even when major markets lie just beyond them. Even when goods reach a border, different regulations often stop them. Trucks are inspected repeatedly, paperwork must be redone, and tariffs averaging around 10% add further expense. While that percentage seems small, it puts African firms at a severe disadvantage compared with economic blocs where internal trade is nearly tariff-free. Small traders sometimes bypass rules through informal routes or bribes, which might work for minor shipments but not for large companies operating at industrial scale. For those firms, delays and unpredictable costs quickly erase profits, making overseas trade more reliable than regional trade. Yet large firms are exactly what the continent needs for industrialization. Such companies invest in machinery, train workers, and help build infrastructure. Today, about 85% of employment in sub-Saharan Africa is outside the formal economy, and manufacturing accounts for only around 10% of economic output. This creates a paradox. Although wages appear low, production is often expensive because businesses must supply services that infrastructure fails to provide. Energy is a striking example. Factories in countries like Nigeria or Kenya often rely on diesel generators for hours each day, even when major hydroelectric or gas power sources exist in neighboring states. Power grids are not sufficiently interconnected to allow routine cross-border electricity trade. Instead of accessing cheaper shared energy, firms produce their own electricity using costly fuel. As a result, nations import generators, fuel contracts, spare parts, and maintenance services from distant regions despite having resources nearby. A unified market could solve many of these issues by connecting energy systems, reducing duplication, and enabling countries to draw power from each other, just as regions do within a single nation. Ultimately, Africa's challenge is not a shortage of resources or labor, but the absence of a large, open internal market that allows the continent to trade with itself and retain value from its production. There have been attempts to move in this direction. In 2018, the African Continental Free Trade Area was established to create a single market across the continent. The agreement came into force in 2021 with nearly every country participating. It aims to eliminate tariffs on 90% of goods within 5 to 10 years, and eventually provide free access to at least 97% of products. However, progress has been slow. Trade under the agreement remains limited to pilot shipments and a narrow range of companies. In more than 30 African countries, intracontinental trade has actually declined since the agreement signing, and regional trade still represents less than 15% of total commerce. Customs officials often continue using national tariff schedules. Rules of origin are inconsistently applied, and the systems intended to implement the agreement have developed gradually. The legal framework exists, but consistent enforcement is harder. If genuine economic unity emerges, it could permanently alter Africa's growth path. Businesses would be able to scale up, productivity would increase, and wages could rise, not through external aid, but through expanded opportunity. Achieving that outcome requires removing the hidden costs that push economies outward rather than toward each other. The central question is therefore not whether Africa should become a single country, but whether it can operate as one economy in practice, and whether those who benefit from the current fragmentation are willing to allow that transformation.